Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very first Change the Air mini class. Now, today begins a series of what we're calling mini classes that will focus on different testing options for your home and building. Now, they're designed to give you the most important information on this topic in an easy to understand way. Now, the information is designed, like I said, for the average person. So even if you slept through your 8th grade biology class, don't worry, we've got you covered. And it doesn't matter if you rent or you own, these mini classes are for everyone. Now, over the next few weeks, we will talk about, air, spore trap testing, tests that rely on dust like ERMI and HERTSMI and EMMA. We're going to get into the gravity and mold plate testing, bacteria testing. And we understand that there are so many testing options out there, right? We know it can be hard to know where to start. So because there are no perfect tests, it's really important that you understand what a test can and can't tell you. So that's what we hope to accomplish today. Now, we want you to feel empowered so that when you're talking with professionals and they say, everything looks good, you can look at the results and look at the report and actually understand for yourself what you're seeing, right? So you can feel confident in that assessment of your home. So for each mini class, here's what you can expect. We're going to break down the pros and cons of a specific test, how it should be used, and how to read those test results, and a bit more. And as a bonus, if you haven't gone to changetheairfoundation.org, sign up for our newsletter. Here's why. By clicking that Join the Community button, at the end of this series, we're going to be sending out a testing cheat sheet guide. Now, this guide is gold. It will have so much great information, easy to understand, quick reference that you're going to want to hang on to this, save it to your hard drive, print it out. And the only way to get it, though, is to sign up for our newsletter. Now, that said, I want to welcome Mark Levy, who will be taking us through these mini classes. Thanks so much, Mark, for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to enjoy this.
So today's mini class is just focusing on air or spore trap testing, and it's probably the test that's most commonly used, but just because it's common doesn't mean it's not without limitations. So I'm just going to let Mark take it away.
Well, thank you again. Let me just kind of put up the screen here for us to walk you through the presentation, and I'm going to start here and expand it a little bit. So first thing I want to say is welcome to Testing 101. This is such a great place for me to be able to share with you how you can change the air in your home. And one of the ways that you can do that is actually through air sampling. And we're going to talk a little bit about air sampling. The most common type of air sampling that's done is really what we call non-viable air sampling, which is really spore trap sampling. And it's really a direct examination that's conducted at the lab. So there are certain types of strengths and limitations in sampling that you're going to have when it comes to this type of air sampling. So we're going to talk about the strengths, the limitations that are there, when you can use these air samples in terms of how it could benefit you, and then how to read an air sample in terms of the lab report itself and what it means in terms of how the interpretation could actually help you understand what's going on in your particular home. But before we do that, I've actually wanted to kind of go through the types of equipment and media that's used with the air sampling, and I've done this really quick little video that I want to share with you. So let me go ahead and do that, and we'll be right back with you. This is a piece of equipment that we use for indoor air quality investigations when we're doing air sampling. It's called the BioPump Plus. And what we do is that we set this up, we turn on the machine, we hit quick start, which is going to be set up for 5 minutes, as you can see here. And that's what we typically run when we're doing air sampling for mold spores. Now I'm going to take this tape off this little cassette here, and this is what we call a spore trap. It's made by Aerosol, and as you can see here, there's an inlet side where the airflow comes in, and there's a little black dot right there that actually represents a slide. There's a glass slide in there with a little sticky film that's there. So as the air gets pulled in by the biopump, it actually traps all the particulates onto that slide. So I'm going to set this on top of the biopump. I'm going to set it up for 5 minutes as we have, and I'm going to start it, and we're going to run it, and we're going to start collecting. Now, that's really a demonstration of what you would do if you're going to do an ambient air sample. An ambient air sample is actually taking an air pump that we showed you, putting it in the middle of a room and collecting the air from the middle of that particular room. Now, there are other ways that you can use air sampling, and this is one of the things that I think is most advantageous, and that's when you're trying to identify if there is mold behind walls or actually within ceiling areas as well. And so we use this particular tube here. This device is called a wall cavity tube. And the way that we use this is that we take the cassette that we showed you in the video, we attach it and affix it to that. And then we go ahead and we actually add it to the air pump. Now, what you'll do is that you're going to create a hole about the size of a dime in the area where you're going to have maybe some water damage, or you've identified that there is some moisture that's there. Once that hole is actually created, you're going to take this tube and you're going to place it in the hole. You're going to run it for about 1, maybe 2, and sometimes even 3 minutes, and you're pulling the air from that particular cavity, and it's going to actually tell you if you have any kind of mold that's there or not. Now, the same can hold true if you're doing a ceiling. You would actually create that hole, put that in the tube into the hole there, pull it for the same amount of time. And again, you're pulling the air to determine if there is any type of mold issues that are in these interstitial spaces or inside the wall cavity. I show you this because this is really going to be a very good way for you to understand as we go through the presentation, the different types of methods that we use when it comes to air sampling. Now, we talked about the strengths, and there are many strengths when you're dealing with spore trap sampling. And one of it is really the rapid collection of mold spores. So you can essentially take this pump, put it in the middle of a room, maybe do it in some type of wall cavity, and actually collect it fairly quickly. Typically, when you're doing what we call ambient air samples, which is in the middle of a room, it's going to run maybe from 5 minutes to 10 minutes. If you're doing it within wall cavities, anywhere between 1 to 3 minutes at length. So it's a very quick way for you to really assess what's going on within the home. It actually identifies both viable and non-viable spores. What that means is that it gives you a total collection of all the different spores that actually have been traversing through the air. With mold, during its life cycle, they actually put off these very small microscopic organisms called spores. And these spores become airborne, and then they traverse through the air, as well as some of the fragmentation. So what you're doing is that you're actually collecting in totality all the different types of pieces and spores that could be coming from the mold that could be within your home. The other benefit is that you can have a very quick turnaround time. You can have results within 24 to 48 hours to really understand exactly what's going on. Now, what I love to use this for, and really where I see the major benefit, is to identify where there may be hidden mold. As you can see in this picture diagram right here, you can see there's a lot of staining that's there, but you don't see any mold. Many people can be deceived that there really isn't an issue there because they can't see that there's mold. But when you have that type of damage in terms of staining that's there, there's more likely than not that there's going to be mold that's harboring behind there. So it's ideal to actually test in these areas to determine if there is any type of hidden mold. And you do this through wall cavities as well as ceiling cavities. Now, you also have many areas throughout your home where you have, for example, in cabinets where there is plumbing issues, and sometimes you have a leak. You'll have the same type of scenario that's there. You may see certain types of staining. It may not be of an issue to you. So you could do air samples inside confined spaces. And that's going to give you an idea in terms of the different types of molds that may be actually accumulating within that particular area. Attics and crawl spaces are another really good way to be able to determine if your home has been impacted. Now, attics and crawl spaces are really important areas for you to look at, because anything that's going on in the attic or the crawl space can make its way into your home. So to determine if you do have a source area that's there, air sampling in that particular area could be really a good spot for you to do to determine if there is any kind of issues. Now, when you're dealing with mold, you obviously, once you determine that, you want to have remediation done. And this is another way for you to determine if the remediation's been done correctly or if it still needs additional cleaning. So we still use air sampling to be able to determine if it's been done right. Now, there are some limitations that actually are going to come about when you're dealing with these types of sampling. The first thing is that it's a snapshot in time. Even though it's a rapid collection, it's only giving you a very short time frame in terms of the air quality for the amount of time that you're pulling the air. So in other words, it's not going to give you a day's worth of information of the quality of your air. It's only going to be the amount of time that you're pulling from that point in time. And what that really means is that you can actually have variability. In other words, when you do an air sample, let's say at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then you decide to do it maybe even 30 minutes later, it could be totally different. And the reason that's different is because airflow is very dynamic. It's constantly moving. And as you do certain things throughout your home, maybe through movement or vibrations or certain types of air pressure movements, you're going to have changes in your airflow that could result in changes in your results. The other thing is that it only analyzes to what we call the genera level or the genus. The genus is really the top level of the molds that are there. And it's important to understand that you have mold, but it's also more important to really understand, if you can, the species, but this doesn't really give you the species. And the reason why this could be challenging is because certain molds like Aspergillus and Penicillium do have the ability to be very similar. That's why when you see on the sorry about that. That's why when you see on the lab report, they have Aspergillus penicillium-like, it's basically saying it cannot distinguish between the two. And so really, it's giving you an idea of a comparison that there are molds that are there, but they don't know whether it's going to be Aspergillus or penicillium. And that could be kind of complex when you're really trying to measure where these issues might be coming from. Is it outdoors or whether it's within your indoor environment? For that reason, we always pair up air sampling with other types of sampling methods so that we can differentiate between the different types of species that are there. Now, when you're using air samples, it's really important to really try to identify where source areas happen to be harboring. And this is one of the key areas where I think air samples are really beneficial. And that's really identifying if there is hidden mold that happens to be harboring behind building material. And you can see here in the picture here that there's different areas. We talked about this before. We could do ceiling cavities, we could do wall cavities, we could do it within cabinets as well as in the attic area, and it really helps us identify if there is any issues that are there. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's really important to be able to really determine where the mold is so that you can actually isolate the mold and be able to create a work plan that's going to help you take out the, what I call manufacturing plant of where that mold is so that you can have a cleaner, healthier environment. Air sampling is also really used appropriately when you're dealing with other types of sampling methods. So just to use air samples and only air samples to determine what's going on in your home is not really a good idea. It's only going to give you a piece of the puzzle. So really, you really want to be able to use other types of labs, such as source sampling that we talked about, whether it be air samples with surface samples, maybe even dispersion or progressive samples. We could talk about that in other series as we move on. But air sampling is not always one and done. It's just a small piece of the what I call environment of what you're really looking to identify. And then we also use it, as we talked about earlier, for post-verification testing. What that means is that when you have remediation, you're going to actually remove the mold. And when they do that, they establish what we call a containment. Now, in this picture here, you can see that the containment is set up with plastic sheeting. It is an isolated area. They seal it. They put in what we call engineering controls to suppress any kind of air movement so it doesn't have mold spores or fragments that get outside there to contaminate the rest of the home. And as you can see in this particular picture, you can see in the backdrop here, there's been some building material that has been removed. We're going in here, we're actually inspecting it, testing it with the air to determine if it's been properly cleaned. That's one way that we can use it in terms of post-verification testing. On the other side of it is that you have the possibility of what we call cross-contamination. Cross-contamination is the movement of those spores and fragments outside that containment area, which could cross-contaminate and impact the indoor air. So we'll go ahead and we'll set up air sampling to see if there's been any type of movement in terms of the spores or the fragments that have come from inside that containment area. Another area where it's quite useful in terms of being able to identify issues within a home is with legal cases. And I know that these are not fun, but at the end of the day, it's used often. It's actually very much accepted within the legal environment to really do air samples, but it's really important to do it with other air samples. You don't want to just use air samples and only air samples, especially in a legal case. You really want to have a good foundation of what's going on within your indoor environment. So let's talk a little bit about how we could actually read these lab reports. Now, the lab reports are really the what I call the byproduct of the sampling that you've done. You're going ahead, you've taken these air samples, you've sent it to the lab. The lab is going to analyze it through what we call microscopy, or looking at it underneath the microscope, and they're actually going to count the various types of spores and fragments that are on the slide. And so in this particular case, what we're showing you here is that there are ambient room air samples. And when we do ambient air samples, we're always going to compare that to your outdoor air. The reason why we do that is because air, in terms of mold spores, is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So you want to make sure that when you're doing certain types of air samples, specifically when you're dealing with ambience, in other words, doing sampling in the middle of a room, you're going to want to compare that to the outdoors, because there's going to be an outdoor influence when you open up doors and windows and things of that nature. So we always make sure that we do outdoor baseline samples. In this case, we do one in the front, we do one in the rear, because the ecology is different. Now, when we're doing air samples, for example, with what I would consider to be like wall cavities or in confined spaces, there's not going to be that much of an influence with your outdoor baseline. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to really look at the various types of molds and types of indicators that are there. And we're going to share that with you in a moment. So when we look at the lab report, one of the things that we want to do is that we want to take a look at the different types of molds that have actually been detected. And in this particular case, you can see here that there are a number of molds that have been identified here. Now, when I look at these lab reports, the key thing that I'm going to be looking for is the types of molds that are there. Molds that are indicator molds for water damage. And what are those types of molds? Well, Aspergillus, Penicillium, Cutonium, Stachybotrys, Eucladium, and even Fusarium are different types of molds that are really indicator molds for water damage. So when I see those molds that are there, that's actually telling me that the source of the issue is not coming from outdoors, it's actually coming from inside. The other thing that I look for is the concentration level. So the higher the concentration level, the more likely that you're going to see that there's going to be the source coming from inside. So in this particular case, if I just take a step back and I look at the outdoor baseline and I look at Aspergillus penicillium, you can see the levels that were here on both the outdoors from the front and the rear. And then when you take a look at it here, you could see how heavy that concentration is. So again, this is telling me that the source is coming from within. And then obviously looking at the individual types of molds like Cutonium and Stachybotrys, these are more indicators of water damage type molds that are coming from within. The other thing that we look for when we're dealing with the lab report is that we're going to look at how many different types of molds that are there, but then also we'll look at the individual molds themselves and the percentage. So in other words, here's your total spore count right here. And you can see right here that Aspergillus penicillium is 96%. of the total spore concentration that we picked up here. That is another indicator that it's coming from within and the source is somewhere in that particular area. And again, when we're dealing with these molds, we want to be able to make sure that we're really focused in on the types of molds and the key indicators that are here, because even in low concentrations, those can really mean that the source is really somewhere within that particular area. Now, the other thing that we look at is what's going to be your hyphal fragments. Hyphal fragments are actual pieces of the mold itself, and these can actually become airborne. And so it's really an indication of mold growth. So the higher the hyphal fragment totals that are there in terms of concentration, the more likely that that source, again, is coming from within your home. Now, the other component that I always look at, and this is really an important aspect of it, and I'm going to move this over here because I think it's blocking the, is that better? So you can see that? Is that better? There we go.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, yeah. So the other thing that we're going to look at is actually the debris rating. And what the debris rating happens to be, it's the amount of particulate matter that shows up on that slide. So we talked about the cassette. That spore trap has a little slide that's in there, and as it pulls the air, it actually pulls all the particle matter into that particular slide, and then it traps it on the slide. So the more particles that you have, the more it's actually going to be accumulating these particles, where it may make it more difficult to be able to read. And so there is a debris rating. It's a range between 1 and 5. The lower the number, the easier or the cleaner that slide's going to be. So if it's cleaner, that means it's easier for the mycologist to be able to determine exactly what type of molds and spores are there. But the more, I should say, the higher that number may be, the more difficult it becomes. It starts to become more cloudier, more difficult for the mycologist to be able to look at. So you can have a rating, for example, of a 4, and you're showing different types of mold concentrations, but it may be overshadowing the true indication of what's going on within your particular home. So again, you always want to look at that. And one of the ways that you can actually gauge in terms of being able to reduce the particulate matter from debris is to lower the amount of collection time. So you really need to look at your environment. In other words, if you have an environment that's very dusty, has a lot of debris that's there, there's more likely that you're going to collect and pull in that type of particulate matter that could overload it and make it very difficult to read. So this is what we do when we're actually looking at the various types of lab reports. Again, just to do a quick review, the most important thing is to really look at the different types of molds in terms of indicator molds that are there. That's going to drive you to understand whether those molds are water damage molds or not, that they're really more so coming from within. You're going to look at the concentration levels, and then you're also going to look at hyphal fragments to see if those are in high concentration. And then you're going to see if there's been any type of debris that could have been really skewing the results of what's going on. By really looking at your report that way, that's going to give you a really good indication in terms of what's going on within your home, and then what you need to do in terms of being able to talk to any type of remediation contractor in terms of how to go ahead and correct it. Well, that's really all I have for that in terms of the overview. Do you have any questions for me?
That was great. Thank you so much. One of the things that I know sometimes people will see in their reports is the phrase normal fungal ecology. And can you tell us just what that means in case that shows up in somebody's report when a professional uses that term?
Yeah, when you're looking at a normal fungal ecology, there's actually 3 conditions that you want to keep in mind. These conditions are actually based on the IRCRC, which is the International Institute for Cleaning Restoration Certification. They have a document called the S520, which is a mold document. And inside that document, they talk about 3 conditions: condition 1, condition 2, and condition 3. Condition 1 would be normal trappings, because we talked about how mold itself is everywhere. And so you're going to have the ability for mold to come in. It's going to actually settle throughout. So we call that normal trappings. That would actually be a condition 1, and it would actually be what we consider to be a normal fungal ecology. And then 2 would be the offspring and the higher concentration of spores and fragments that are in your home. And 3 would be more so the actual physical growth of the mold itself.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we're going to be wrapping up here in just a moment because these are mini classes, but I want to throw a scenario out there and I just want to get your quick thoughts on it because
Sure.
this is what I see typically happen. You hire someone to come in to inspect your home. They look around for 30, 40 minutes and take 3 or 4 air samples that were set up in a few random rooms. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are is that it's too rudimentary. You have to really, number one, as we talked about before in another conversation that you and I had, is that the most important thing for you to do is really understand the history of your home, because water is the key. Water is what's going to create the moisture. And so you really want to follow the moisture event, right? Or the moisture issues that you have within your home. So if they're coming in for 30, 40 minutes and they're just doing a very cursory overview, and then they're actually setting up air pumps throughout different rooms within the home, and then they're telling you based on those results that everything's going to be fine, that's not going to be really deep enough for you to really understand what's really going on within your home. Air sampling, it's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's not the entire puzzle. It's not the entire picture. So you really want to use this in conjunction with proper inspection and really identification of various areas of where there are going to be certain types of mold issues. When you do air sampling, it's all about really validating whether there is or there isn't certain things going on within the home, but that's based on certain types of preconceived notions that there was a water event that was there, or there's been certain types of molds that have been there. Once you do that, now you have the means of using some of the types of sampling methods to really kind of gauge in on what's going on. So it's a screening, but it's not a very good in-depth screening to say that everything's okay within your home.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. If you're listening and you found this helpful, do me a favor, like, follow, and share us. Come back next week. We're going to keep unpacking various tests so we can demystify this process for you. And if you haven't already, please head over to changetheairfoundation.org, sign up for our newsletter, because we have lots of great information coming, including that testing cheat sheet guide that I don't want you to miss out on. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much.